Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This being a show where we talk about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the Winchesters, Season 1, Episode 10. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Well, first and foremost, let's start off with Mary and John's side of things. It is interesting that she got accepted into, KSU, the college she wanted to get into, and she was kind of worried, thinking like, well, what if I don't get into it? What if even if I do, what do I want to study? And I think it is interesting, once again, the parallels of John and Dean, because Dean was kind of like a carbon copy of his dad, and obviously Sam ended up taking after a little bit of his mom, which is just, once again, just interesting parallels, considering his mom wanted out of this life, Sam got out of this life, and they kind of did, ultimately, the Winchesters John and Mary did kind of get out of this life, but also John, obviously his grief is what pushed him to make Dean into a carbon copy of himself, essentially, and why he pushed his son so hard. But once again, Dean took more after him. Sam ended up being kind of the rebel, while Dean was kind of the quote-unquote good soldier. So just, once again, those parallels just running deeper and deeper, even in just little moments like that. But John and Mary end up meeting a fellow man of letters, Porter, which they're like, wait, I thought all the men of letters was going. It's like, I guess maybe they don't know that the men of letters is also an international thing. So, once again, did they replenish their ranks over the next few decades or something like that? Obviously, stateside, there's no more men of letters, but we know there are international, there's at least a British men of letters, like, still active, because that's who Sam and Dean interact with, like, later in Supernatural. So I wonder, they just not aware, they probably think of the Men of Letters only as a US based operation, and not knowing that there is one across the pond still active that's kind of let the Americans do whatever they're going to do, who cares, because the Men of Letter branch there is, once again, there's kind of no love lost between the Men of Letters and Hunters. They look down on the Hunters, so that's probably like let the Hunters do whatever they're dealing with. Like, you would think the Accreta, but maybe in their eyes it's like the Accreta aren't that big of a threat, there's something even bigger that they're dealing with. Or once again, it could just be a situation of they'll step in when they need to, just let the Hunters do the dirty work, like I was saying. Or it could just be the Men of Letters don't quite exist, maybe like remnants of the American, maybe there were remnants of the Europe branch that just haven't replenished their ranks either. Either way, putting all that aside, kind of getting caught up in the minutia of it, like, I don't think it really, I don't know, maybe I'm just kind of overthinking things. But they meet a man of letters named Porter, who's played by, God, what was was it just Charles? I can't remember, from The Nanny, Mr. Sheffield. I was like, hey! But then I also remember, it's like, oh yeah, he played a character in The Magicians. That might be the most recent thing I saw him in, which I'm like, I'd rather remember you for playing the character of Mr. Sheffield, because his character from The Magicians sucked a lot. If you've seen The Magicians, you know what context his character had in the story. Either way, putting all that aside, he comes in and he's like, hey, I'll help you. But he does come, it is a little suspicious that despite all this, the Men of Letters have been gone for a while, and all of a sudden you pop up, and it's like, right, we're only hearing about you now, partway through this battle with the Accreta, so what's going on? So, but I guess it should have been pretty clear early on that he kind of had the mad scientist vibe type of thing going on, because he's like, oh yeah, I'm the one who kind of experimented on stuff. He's also the one like, oh yeah, we could actually help remove the stingers. The moment he was like, oh, we can remove the stingers and humans will be okay, like, afterwards, I was already like, it seems a little suspicious. I was like, I don't know if I 100% buy that. But it's like, yeah, certain aspects, and especially him being like, yeah, after they took everything from him, Mary and John are like, what? He's like, oh yeah, what they took from all of us. It's like, yeah, this guy, they're like, something's not right about this guy. He said he's not married. He never had a family of his own, just because of the nature of what they do. But, John noticed that he has a kind of a tan line from, like, not even just from the Men of Letters like ring or whatever, but from like, it seems like he's like, right, men that guys he knew from the army would do the same thing, like take off their ring and kind of keep it where it was their dog tags as well. So it's like, why is he hiding the fact that he had a family? Like I was like, right, the Akrita must have taken your family. So why would you lie about that? Why would you hide that? If this is personal, like that make you go like, oh, well, we understand, like, people have lost people to this. So it's like, yeah, of course. But we find out later on, it's not actually Porter. It's his assistant, Porter's assistant, Jack. So I love him kind of like dropping his natural accent to put on a like Southern American accent, which I was like, oh, I like that. I just think that's funny because it's like, oh, here, I have to drop. Oh, thank goodness I get to drop that British accent. It's like, even though that's the actor's not, I don't know. I think stuff like that's funny when you think about it. But either way, it's actually really sad, and it actually kind of, in twofold, I think it's really interesting. One, it ties into that voiceover from Dean saying it like, right, when it comes to like kind of a normal life or whatever, what are you willing to do? Kind of having that normal life isn't always the easiest thing, but like how far are you willing to go to get it? That ties into the overarching theme of everything with Jack. And then you also have the opening where that woman Dorothea gets attacked, and you're like, okay, what's that? Because it's like, oh, it's the Akrita, but what's that got to do with anything? It's the main motivation behind Jack, because his wife has been in an induced coma ever since, and Dorothea was his wife, and he used a spell to put her in a magical sleep because he was trying to find a way to bring her back, and he did all that for love in a way, which I love how that conversation plays out later on when Mary's like, yeah, but that's not love. The fact is, Jack was so caught up in what he wanted that he never thought about the cost of what it would cost him. It would cost him his humanity in the long run. I thought Mary was going to go more down the route of, oh, he didn't bother asking Dorothea if this is even what she wanted. He was so caught up in what he wanted, he never thought like, oh, would Dorothea be okay with this or not? This whole thing, well, getting back to his main thing, he's studied the Akrita long enough because he's always been the experimentation guy, and that's why he got kicked out of the Men of Letters, because he was the type of person who would experiment on humans, because for him it's like, right, whatever we got to do, this is a war and we got to do whatever we got to do. Once again, we see that obviously like there are people even amongst the hunters and even amongst the Men of Letters who have that mentality where it's like there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Whatever we got to do, we got to do. And he's extra motivated because it's for his family. I mean, the reason why they came after Dorothea is because of him. Because, right, he kept digging into the Men of the Akrita, I think, even after getting kicked out of the Men of Letters. So he probably didn't have their help and protection anymore. And sadly, that didn't extend to his family anymore because I think he got booted out by then. But still, it sucks that it's like, right, this is the person you love that was taken from you by the Akrita. So once again, he's personally motivated, but he's planning on using the stingers because he's modifying them so that with the right placement, he could transfer his wife's consciousness into Mary's body, and even suggesting he's going to do the same thing to John. But he's like, no, don't worry. You're not going to disappear. You're going to be in there with us along the ride. It's like yours and John's love will kind of fold into ours. I was like, you sound super psychotic right now. I get your motivation, but road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I wouldn't even say this is good intentions. It actually reminded me of the 100. Spoilers. There's a whole season dedicated to this very storyline. So, putting people's consciousnesses in other people's bodies, that's a whole storyline angle. So it's just interesting. Even the fact is that I wonder, is that true to all of the Men of Letters, or was that specifically just his thing of he's like, oh yeah, like basically he experimented on monsters too, and he kind of made them guard dogs. So that probably was his specialty, because like the golem that attacks John this episode, that was kind of pretty metal how that was handled too. Like his, like that furnace, like him, Mary bringing like the door down and it decapitates the golem, but the golem's still going. I thought was going to happen because it was headless. It wasn't going to know who was in front of it, and it was going to end up killing Jack itself. But no, in turn, Mary ended up like destroying its head because of the scroll inside of its mouth. And that happened. The body hardened and turned kind of to stone and landed on top of Jack, killing him. I mean, he died by his wife's side. And, obviously Mary and John were able to buried them side by side. So, I mean, there's some semblance of them being together at the very least. But yeah, back to that conversation, Mary was like, yeah, I hope we're not going to end up like that. And John was like, no, we won't. Which is like, that's such an interesting thing because I'm like, well, I don't know if you go as far as saying John lost his humanity. Once again, he wasn't the greatest dad out of grief, sure, but I think you can still make a parallel with Jack, and that does make you kind of go, I don't know if I'd go as far as say like he necessarily lost his humanity, but like I said, grief ended up making him not the best person either. So, but I don't think he went that far. It's still kind of like still kind of a bit of a gray area, like in that comparison. So I don't know if I'd go as far as saying, like I said, he lost his humanity, but you can't help but make direct parallels in some regards. So that's actually really sad that things turned out that way. It's actually very tragic, in that regard. But so sadly, there's that side of things, and then on the Latza and Carlos side of things, Carlos is because it's like, yeah, him and Anton are in a much better place after last episode. But the problem is, for Carlos, it's like, yeah, he hasn't had anything serious in a very long time. And now he's remembering, it's like, I can't stop thinking about Anton and his dimples and his pancake face. And it's like, that's a good thing. But for Carlos, it's like, no, because it's like with everything going on, you can't really be distracted. I need to have focus, but that's also another flip side of that. He didn't really think about. It's like, you need stuff like that as motivation of being even more reason to fight, let love be something like, hey, you fight for, it's like, hey, this is something worth living for. But for Carlos, he sees it more as a distraction, but it's also because he's scared. The fact is, getting like this about someone he hasn't, and he's thinking about Anton all the time. It's like understandable why he'd be a little worried. But that in turn gave Lotta the idea of like, hey, let's track down someone who used to be infected by the Akrita, and basically those memories have to be in there somewhere. So if we can get access to those memories, we might be able to find out where the queen is, and that leads them to Roxy. I was like, interesting. And sadly, her life fell apart. Girlfriend left her. She lost her home. She lost her job because of the whole, disappearing. Because I was about to say, like, well, you were still doing your job. But I wonder, is that, like, after she got found out by the squad, she probably abandoned her job, and that's where she was going for weeks on end. Or maybe doing the whole Rock and Roxy thing was kind of like such a side thing that she wasn't actually doing her actual job. Either way, like, she's kind of hit hard times because it's not just that all that fell apart. It's also because she remembers the Akrita stuff in bits and pieces, but she remembers it enough and she can't talk to anyone about it because they're going to think she's crazy. So they know she isn't. And hey, like, help us with whatever you can remember. But once again, it's just in pieces until Lotta's like, hey, I can actually help you forget, which Carlos is like, wait, what? Because even I was like, is Lotta just saying that just to get her to help? But it's like, no, she actually knows how to help because of Tony. What was it Carlos called her? Oh, you dozing tramp. I love it. It's like her, and I was like, oh, that's it. Because they set up the whole, like, there being like Lotta and Tony. It was like, oh, but nothing really happened. It's like, him being a djinn, being able to enter your dreams. I'm like, oh yeah, which is actually like, ooh, that's kind of sexy and stuff like that. She's, teaching it, it's like, but he taught me like some magic and stuff like that could help put a person in a meditative state. He's like, ooh, I'd love to be put in a meditative state. I love it. She's like, it's not like that, mostly. I thought that was really cute, which I'm also like, hey, I'm happy things are happening on that front. That's cute. It's actually kind of sweet. Everyone's kind of love life is on the more positive end of things, but they were able to use the magic Tony taught her. It's like a 2-step process. Bring the memories to the forefront, and then the second aspect of the process is to erase them. They brought all the memories to the forefront, and Roxy was able to point them towards, like, hey, it's in an underground area kind of around here. And because of that, I think she gave them a very general idea of where the Akrita queen might be, but she doesn't want her memories erased because she wants to be able to remember the fact is that she was able to help. She wants to be able to remember the monsters and remember the fact is she played a role in kicking the Akrita's ass, So, which that in turn actually helped Carlos realize, like, right, if Roxy's willing to remember all that terrible stuff, then I can, kind of move past myself and continue to remember Anton. Because he's like, right, before everything with Roxy, like if you had told me that you were able to erase memories, I would have jumped at the opportunity to have my memories of Anton erased. Because even Lata's like, yeah, but that's not helping you kind of run away from this situation, kind of run from love. But it's not until like Roxy was like, no, I want to keep my memories. I want to remember. It's like, right, if Roxy can like decide to keep her memories of something like so traumatic and want to kind of keep fighting afterwards, then at the very least I can, realizing he was kind of wrong to want to kind of get rid of his memories of Anton. So I thought that was kind of nice. Then we get our situation at the end where, well, Roxy did point them in the right direction, and now they know where the Queen of the Akrita are because I didn't remember that they would recognize the lady with like the red hair. I didn't realize they would recognize her because I forgot. It's obviously like that was episode 8. I want to say was the last time like when she was collecting the monsters' essences. I think that was the last time we had seen her. Like I didn't remember that because it had been that long, so I didn't remember that's where they would know her from. So they know the Akrita are there. At the same time, John finds himself in a very complicated situation because Kyle rose up and he's like, oh yeah, I called the cops and like you and me got into a big fight about Marion, and it's like, oh my god, the Akrita are setting you up super hard. Well, because they were already gathered because, right, they're like, yeah, we needed the hunters because they allowed us to capture monster essence, but now that they've been now that we completed that part of the mission, why are we keeping them around? But the Queen needs them around because they could be useful because it's about finding. And now I'm having second guessing. I'm like, is that actually Dean? It looked like it was Dean, but maybe not. Once again, I immediately took it as, oh, it's a timey-wiminess, but I'm like, maybe it's not. Maybe I'm just being stupid and assuming that's Dean. It looked like it was Dean, but it's like, yeah, this is the person who basically got the band together, so we got to find out who they are and stop them, and that's why they're a means to an end. And it's like, yeah, to get that accomplished, we're going to have to spill a little human blood. And I was like, how's that going to play out? It's because you need to putting John in a very compromising position, if it is in fact Dean, like I keep thinking it is, but I'm like, maybe I'm wrong for thinking, it looks like it's Dean, and I'm pretty sure that looks like that's the car. Dean probably got like a version of the car pretty new-ish here. I don't know if that is who I think, if it is supposed to be Dean. Once again, I feel, because I was so certain before, but now I'm second guessing myself. I'm like, it looks like that's supposed to be Jensen Ackles, but I can't tell. But it could be like, well, if John's going to jail, it's not like the Akrita know about that. So it could just be a thing of, yeah, by throwing time off, by putting John, getting him arrested and stuff like that, this other person might have no choice but to show up to kind of keep the timeline intact and stuff like that, right? So that might be an aspect of this whole situation, an unintentional aspect of it. But they're probably thinking like, right, this person put this group of hunters together, so most likely if John's in a compromising position like this and kind of compromises the entire group, then they'll have no choice but to step in. And it's like, oh boy, this isn't good. And Kyle, sadly, the Akrita inside of Kyle ends up using John's knife to stab him. And I don't know how far along the technology is at this point in time in the 70s of fingerprints and stuff like that, because you would, regardless, even if it's a fingerprint situation, it's like, well, you'd be able to tell that the knife was held by Kyle we don't know if John touched it after the fact. And even if he did have his fingerprints on it, Kyle, the argument could be like, well, it was during the struggle, yada, yada, yada. But it's like, with the angle of the blade and stuff, that might be able to prove, like, no, Kyle stabbed himself. So there's that. But regardless of it all, it is John's knife, so his fingerprints would be on it. Once again, I don't know what the fingerprint situation was like in the 70s. So a little Google search just out of curiosity. Obviously, fingerprinting to identify a person has been around for a while, but specifically here in the US, apparently since like it at least became commonplace, I think, in like 1902. But in other places, I think it was specifically China and Japan, it was like way, way earlier. But still, like, the thing, like, I don't know how far, like, the criminology is to be able to go, like, oh, like, notice the angle of the blade. Like, I still think that might end up helping John in the long run. But to me, the real kicker is when Millie came back and she found John over Kyle's dead body. Now, the thing is, him being like, John will be like, oh my God, he was in a Creta the entire time. Then everyone else is going to be like, oh, we see what's what. But the problem is, you can see that look on John's face and on Millie's face. I think John's going to have an issue with his mom later because for an instant, regardless of her being able to know what's what, for an instant, for just, even if it's just for a second, I think he saw it in his mom's eyes where she thought he did that. Because yes, he's had a lot of those anger issues and she's known for a while. That's been a big concern of hers, is that fight inside of him, that she's always been concerned about. And I think in that moment, like the way John's looking, it's almost like he caught it. He caught that glimpse of her. Like, it's like, regardless of you eventually finding out the truth, for a second, you thought I just straight up murdered a dude. You saw me as a monster, even if it was just for a second. The fact is, that even crossed your mind. Like, I saw it in your eyes. I kind of feel like I saw it. Now, whether they make a big point of that or not, whether or not that's just me reading too much into it, but I think it'd be really interesting if they did lean into that a little bit for next episode. So, and the problem is, like, Betty, well, it's going to be interesting to see where Betty falls on this, because she's going to be like John, because she's been so worried about John, especially considering she's the one that's been talking to Kyle and stuff too. And, it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, especially because Betty's going to blame Mary for this. So or Mary, Lotta, and Carlos, but mainly Mary. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see how that all ends up playing out going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.